Disney rebooted the Star Wars franchise at a time where woke storytelling was rising up. It was becoming much more commonplace, and Disney was one of the most powerful forces in that regard. They injected that kind of storytelling into their properties, not just Star Wars, but it certainly was seen in Star Wars. And I think, people go back and forth on woke and what is it? How do you label it? Some people use the word too loosely. But to me, it's sort of an inauthentic brand of storytelling where you want to send a message and you do it either with clunky dialogue or forced situations. It's something that really takes you out of the experience. And certainly with the Acolyte, which was I only saw 3 or 4 episodes, but they were not good, is an example of that kind of storytelling. We saw it elsewhere at times.
Now, Star Wars has just been re-released in the cinema, The Revenge of the Sith, and obviously May the 4th, Star Wars Day, is coming up, or is here, if you're depending on when you're watching this. So I want to ask about the legacy of the Star Wars franchise. Obviously it started, or the first film was released back in 1977. What do you think the legacy overall of Star Wars is on our culture?
It's pretty far reaching. Listen, I think from a marketing point of view, the fact that so many toys and merchandise tie-ins bloomed from that franchise really impacted a lot of what we see just everywhere. It could be on the schoolyard, it could be in a comic book shop. I've spoken to so many filmmakers over the years, and they often just read the same script to me. Yeah, I saw Star Wars and I wanted to be a filmmaker. So I think it had an impact on that perspective, but also just on Hollywood product, the blockbuster franchises, sequels, stories that had this expanding universe that you could take it in different directions. It seemingly had it all. So I think its impact has been profound on pop culture and elsewhere.
Why do you think it was initially so successful? And can you tell us a bit about how Star Wars came about?
Well, George Lucas, the creator, wasn't a big name at the time. It was certainly a risk. It was a struggle. He was actually leaning on some of his filmmaker friends like Francis Ford Coppola at the time for impact, for feedback, for morale boosting. And so, this wasn't the kind of movie where they thought, oh yeah, this is going to be a huge hit. Don't worry about it. Just sit back, relax, and count the money. So that's where it began. Certainly a scrappy production. Harrison Ford was the biggest name at the time, but certainly not Harrison Ford as we know him today. So it came from humble roots, but I think it just spoke to so many audience members. It was good versus evil. It was a young man coming of age, iconic characters. The music, of course, by John Williams speaks for itself. Everything just seemed to fit into place at the time. And even the special effects, which are considered dated today, were revolutionary. And so you had all these different things working together, a perfect storm. And you couldn't help but make sequels and make it, part of Hollywood lore.
Was it a genuinely innovative product at the time? Was it new, or was it kind of based on previous films?
Well, there's been lots of talk that it was sort of inspired by Flash Gordon or the serials of the 1930s. But really, science fiction wasn't exactly hot at the time in the mid 1970s. So afterwards, we saw a lot of clones, a lot of duplicates of the Star Wars model, none really kind of capturing that magic. But yeah, it was something really unique at the time. And even though it looked so new and so fresh and so exciting, it did speak to basic storytelling tropes. And, there's a reason why we, Han, Luke, and Leia, we can just kind of rattle off their names. And yet the newer Star Wars films with Rey and Finn, it just doesn't have remotely that kind of magic and that kind of pull. We just resonate with these characters. Even Darth Vader, the ultimate villain, we have an odd, connection with in a way. And you could blame the costume. You could blame James Earl Jones's iconic voice. So there's lots of reasons behind it. But, Hollywood is full of mistakes and full of trial and error and full of experiments. But sometimes things just fall into place. And this was an example of things falling into place.
When it comes to the story and the message of the story, you said that it was a sort of battle between good and evil. So was this kind of a conservative message? We're already getting into politics, which I promised my bosses I wouldn't do. But do you think this message was like basically a conservative message, as you say, a kind of moral message?
Well, I think at the time, listen, I think George Lucas is a pretty progressive fellow off screen. I don't think he's ever denied that. But I think at the time, the way Hollywood worked, the way storytelling worked, the way storytellers wanted to share their vision. I don't think they were thinking as directly as they are today. I think Lucas has said that there were some parallels with the Vietnam War that he wanted to evoke in the story. But you can watch any of the Star Wars films of that era and not get anything. It certainly wasn't a direct comparison or something that would be heavy-handed. I just think at that moment he just wanted to spin this yarn. This was a story that was within him that he felt very connected with. So yeah, I don't think that was a factor at the time. I think storytellers, listen, in the late 1960s, certainly the culture of U.S. Flower power, Vietnam War protests, that certainly bled into pop culture, and you had some anti-heroes like the Bonnie and Clyde film. But I just don't think that was in the mindset of a Lucas at the time. I think they had different ambitions.
You called it a sci-fi franchise, which on the outside it is a sci-fi franchise, but some people will say it's more close to fantasy than sci-fi. Where do you think it is?
You can go in different directions. One of my favorite movies is Alien. That is science fiction for sure, but it's got horror elements as well. So I think we can quibble around the edges about what this exactly is. But I think science fiction is the most fair description you could apply to it. Some people said it has Western tropes. Again, you can go there as well. I don't directly see that, but I think I mentioned before the copycats that spawned after Star Wars broke out so big. Those were science fiction films, and they were anemic, and they weren't nearly as inspired as Star Wars. But certainly that was the elements, the tropes, the visuals, and we were heading into an age from a special effect point of view where you could bring some of these stories to the screen. You couldn't do it in the 60s and the 50s quite like you did in 1977 and beyond.
Okay, let's stick with the first three films that were made in the 70s. I know it's a weird order, isn't it? But how do you think those films kind of stand today? Do you think they've held their value? Do you still think they're worth watching?
More or less, I think they've held their value. It's funny. There are lines of dialogue in all three movies that are a little bit cringeworthy at times. I think seen from a modern lens. I think George Lucas's sense of humor can be kind of kid-like at times. And I think we just accept it now because we have such an affection for that franchise. I know people hold Empire Strikes Back in the highest regard. It was darker, more sophisticated. The ending was brooding. It was a literal cliffhanger. And then some people say, with Return of the Jedi, the Ewoks were silly and too kid-friendly, and there were some elements there. I don't disagree with that, but I think those three films got so much right. And I think that Return of the Jedi concluded with such panache that I think those minor complaints are exactly that, minor. I just think that this is a incredible franchise. And listen, you can't have this saga, as flawed as it is today, without the bedrock, without the foundation of those three films. I think they got so much right and really told the story as it should have been told. And then we've had issues ever since.
Yeah, let's move on from the original films, and as you say, the later films are more controversial. So in the early noughties, George Lucas comes back and he creates these three prequel films. Now, at the time, a lot of people said these films were not very good, the animation was bad, again, cringeworthy lines, bad dialogue. You've got some really strange characters like Jar Jar Binks, who I think basically got cut out of the later films. But then a lot of people kind of revise that and say, actually, these prequels were good. They were well written. They had quite an interesting, complex storyline. And particularly compared to the sequels, they're much better. So how do you assess the prequels today?
One of the joys I have as a film critic is to watch a movie, savor it, figure out whether it was good, bad, or indifferent, tell people about it, but then come back in 10 or 20 years, maybe even more, and reassess it and just see how it stood up over time. And I think that these prequels have stood up better than I expected, but their flaws remain. I mean, some of the dialogue is just terrible. I don't think George Lucas will ever go down as a great actor's director. He turned really good performers like Natalie Portman into cardboard-like characters at times. That seems like an odd feat to accomplish from a major filmmaker with such a legacy. Having said all that, I think those prequels had an idea, had a vision, had a scope, knew what they were trying to say. And I think that Revenge of the Sith, recently re-released and doing quite well at the box office, was actually a pretty good film and really did carry the themes of the story and really kind of led the way from that chapter to what they now call A New Hope, the original Star Wars film. So I think they got a lot right in that. And I think that actually the prequels got better as they went along. I also think that George Lucas was just so enamored with the digital toolbox he had at his disposal now as opposed to in the late 1970s that he went a bit overboard. I think there's just so much computer generated effects, too many robots. I think you lost that human connection at times. So I think that was an issue and a problem that was there in the 1990s and early 2000s and still today. But yeah, I think, and if we get to, if we talk to the more recent films, there's something genuine and raw and coherent about Lucas's vision through the flawed prequels that we're missing today.
So he had a kind of coherent storyline throughout those three prequels, which is quite different from the sequels, which came out a few years ago. So again, sticking on the prequels, the kind of journey of Anakin turning into Darth Vader and seeing this, what was a little boy, turn into quite an evil character. It was quite an interesting development. How do you think? I mean, Anakin, I forget the name of the actor. You're going to remind me, but he
Hayden Christensen.
Yeah, Hayden Christensen. Yeah, so he is criticised by some for not being a very good actor. Can you talk a bit about Anakin's storyline and whether he did a good job as an actor?
Yeah, it's hard to say whether Hayden Christensen is a mediocre actor who wasn't right for the part or wasn't served well by George Lucas, the director. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I don't think that Christensen has had a spectacular post-Star Wars career. I think that may be indicative that his skill set may be limited. But, I think, especially in Revenge of the Sith, he does enough. I think he does enough to capture the angst, the anger, the transformation of the character. I don't think he holds that particular movie back. I'd say he's less successful in the previous film. And then in the first, The Phantom Menace, with that poor young actor, I don't think he was served well by the story or Lucas. And so I don't think that was really a great choice. And I also think in that early manifestation, you want to see a little bit of wickedness in that kid. Like he had a little bit of trouble in mind. And I don't think they did that very successfully. But yeah, I don't think that was the best casting choice. And casting is huge. I mean, we've seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe the dawn of Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. You couldn't cast a better actor. And then along comes a Scarlett Johansson, a Samuel L. Jackson, a Chris Evans. Those casting choices really cemented the MCU as the force that it is today. And I think from the Star Wars point of view, some less than stellar choices.
Okay, so Star Wars is a huge IP, as they say in Hollywood, and it's a massive cash cow. And George Lucas decided to sell the IP to Disney, and then they've created these sequel films. Now, I think I know what you're going to say, but why don't you describe the sequel films? What happened there? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, they wanted to restart the franchise. It makes complete sense. They had complete control over Lucasfilm properties. I understand that. And I think people were clamoring for it. And I think when Star Wars The Force Awakens came out, I thought that was a pretty credible attempt to reboot this saga. You had some of the old players like Han Solo in there, Carrie Fisher as well as Princess Leia. You had new figures which seemed at least interesting, Rey and Finn and Poe. So I thought that was a successful reboot. And yes, it copied a little bit from the original Star Wars film as far as the story and the recreation of the Death Star. But generally speaking, I thought that put things in motion. And that's exactly what you wanted. And I think that the second and third parts of that new trilogy were just dreadful in that they seemed discombobulated. There wasn't a flow of story. You'd introduce characters, then they would disappear down the road. I think some of the building blocks from the first film, The Force Awakens, weren't successfully advanced in the new films. They tweaked characters that shouldn't have been tweaked. I mean, even I think Mark Hamill's been a little bit grumpy about the evolution of Luke Skywalker in those films. And you saw the box office numbers go down. The Force Awakens was a blockbuster. And the last two films did well, but you can see that the grosses went down and down. And, people just were very frustrated by the product. And I get it. There was seemingly no plan. And that's maybe the worst thing you could say about those films. It just didn't seem like there was a vision. And, George Lucas, when he didn't have his A game, he always had a vision.
Yeah, it seemed like the plots of the three films were just so disconjointed. There weren't like a proper sort of coherent theme throughout the three. J.J. Abrams, I think he directed the last one, and he's obviously an incredibly talented director. How do you think he did sort of finishing off the franchise or the series?
Not well, and I think part of it is not his fault. He directed The Force Awakens. He handed it off to Rian Johnson. I think Rian Johnson just went in his own direction, and that's where the trouble begins. And Rian Johnson's a talented director and a smart fellow, but I don't think he really got the mission and didn't really seem to be on the same page. And then by the third film, J.J. Abrams was trying to course correct, push away characters who were a bit alienating, get the old spirit back. But I think by then it was too late. I think there's a lot of clunky moments. And, as a film critic, I love to watch movies again and again. I just recently rewatched Revenge of the Sith. I've yet to rewatch The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker. I have no interest. I just feel I'll be let down. And maybe I will at some point, but it's a sign for me as someone who grew up on Star Wars and was a little boy collecting the action figures that I'm out. It doesn't interest me. I just was disappointed with where they steered the ship, and it was just a lost opportunity.
So I mentioned that Disney bought the IP, and they've been producing not just these sequels, but endless numbers of spin-offs and movies and TV shows all around Star Wars, and they've got loads of merchandise and these theme parks and everything else. So can you assess the kind of extra content? I know that, for example, Rogue One, that's one of the films they made, that a lot of people seem to like that film, but then some of the other content not so much.
Yeah, it's in a mixed bag, and that's being generous. It does seem like they're rushing out a lot of content. The Mandalorian obviously caught fire, and I think that was the truest feel, and I'll use that a generic term, but that's just the best way I can describe it, for Star Wars. It felt like a Star Wars product, and that's Jon Favreau had a hand in that, and of course he's a terrific and talented director and producer. So yeah, it's been mixed bag to be kind. There have been some outright flops like The Acolyte. It was just a dreadful show. Other ones just didn't kind of grab the zeitgeist, like Obi-Wan Kenobi. They're going to keep on keeping on, I guess, and it's frustrating. And even Andor, which is considered probably the most respectable of all the Disney Plus spin-off TV shows, really hasn't drawn a big crowd. And I think that's a problem, because now we finally got this show that really does capture the essence of Star Wars, that is well received by critics, that doesn't have anger with the fans, but I just think the fan base seems to be shrinking. And I think one of the good things about the Revenge of the Sith re-release is it maybe kicked the franchise again and said, hey, wait a minute, we do love this. We just want good stuff. So we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, I think the rush for more titles, exploiting the IP, not bringing out your best, that hurts. It waters down a franchise. And, a quick aside, we worry about the Bond series, about that happening there now that Amazon is in control. Will there be a Miss Moneypenny spinoff? Will there be other offshoots and prequels and reboots and sequels and things? The Bond saga is special because it's so pure. And I think Star Wars has lost that.
Don't do a Miss Moneypenny spin-off. Oh, God. Okay, so I promised I wouldn't bring this up, but I have to because I'm sorry, it just is so obvious. But Disney has made the series really woke. I mean, it just has. Can you talk about some of the kind of woke themes? I think you mentioned The Acolyte. Now, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen a lot of this stuff, to be honest, but I know that there's a lot of commentary around that was kind of very, very in-your-face woke.
Yeah, Disney rebooted the Star Wars franchise at a time where woke storytelling was rising up. It was becoming much more commonplace, and Disney was one of the most powerful forces in that regard. They injected that kind of storytelling into their properties, not just Star Wars, but it certainly was seen in Star Wars. And I think, people go back and forth on woke and what is it? How do you label it? Some people use the word too loosely. But to me, it's sort of an inauthentic brand of storytelling where you want to send a message and you do it either with clunky dialogue or forced situations. It's something that really takes you out of the experience. And certainly with The Acolyte, which was I only saw 3 or 4 episodes, but they were not good, is an example of that kind of storytelling. We saw it elsewhere at times. I mean, even in The Last Jedi, there was sort of a rich versus poor theme and a casino subplot, which wasn't effective, didn't really push the story along in any compelling ways, and felt like for the first time in a Star Wars movie that there was some lecturing going on. And George Lucas, for all his flaws as a storyteller, I never got that from him. So I think that certainly didn't help Star Wars. And then you've got this army of YouTube commentators, and some of them are very smart and very bright and very very passionate about this franchise, and they were complaining about it, and they had a lot of good points.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a bit of a debate between some of the actors, and obviously, getting Hollywood actors, almost all of them come from a very particular political mindset. And then they sort of were arguing with a lot of the fans of Star Wars, some of the actors saying the fans are just racist and, misogynistic and sexist and whatever. So what do you make of this kind of tension between the fans and some of the actors?
I think it's really poorly thought out. I think actors attacking their fans in any capacity is never a good idea. I think calling them racist is a worse idea. I think if you look at the Star Wars product, you can just obviously point to Lando Calrissian, a beloved figure who was black, and no one cared that he was black. He was just Lando Calrissian because that was an iconic character. And listen, in recent years we had Rogue One, which was a very good Star Wars movie, maybe the best of all the recent films. And that was a very diverse cast as well. And no one cared. And they didn't care because it was a good movie, because it felt like Star Wars, because it had a compelling idea behind it. And so the fact that there were people of color and different characters and situations, we just shrugged. I think that fans in general are not looking to be racist or sexist or homophobic. But if they see product that is inferior and they sense that there's a message in play or that diversity is kind of superseding storytelling, they get a little grumpy. And I think that's a fair complaint. And I think for the actors to not acknowledge that is their fault. And listen, there's some kooks out there who don't want a diverse Star Wars. I'm sure there is. There's kooks everywhere. But let's ignore them. I mean, I think they don't represent the franchise fans. I think most of them are just good people who love this story so much and they want the best of the best.
Now, I have to admit that when I was a kid, I really did like Star Wars, and like many kids, and I was a bit obsessed with it. But today, I've gone off it mostly because, again, the recent stuff is just pretty rubbish. The sequel films, as you said, were not good, and it looks like Disney wants to continue kind of drubbing this. They're going to continue making films and so on. And sometimes I see videos on the internet of Star Wars adults, and you just think, come on, move on with your life. But I know that sounds quite harsh. But listen, I want to ask, final question. Where is the series going? Now, I think they're going to make some more films, right? They're going to make some more trilogies. So can you talk about the future of Star Wars?
It's hard to pinpoint because there's been a lot of talk of a new trilogy by this filmmaker, a new saga by this pair of filmmakers, and then they either don't happen or they're delayed or they just kind of go into the ether and we don't know what's going on. It seems like there will be a Star Wars Starfighter coming with Ryan Gosling. That seems pretty credible, pretty serious. A Mandalorian film is coming our way as well. Beyond that, I don't think Disney will slow down. They haven't learned a lesson that maybe less is more, I don't think, within this franchise. But yeah, it's a lot of question marks. And when the new films come out, what kind of reception will they have? Will they be just a generic blockbuster that does well at the box office? Will they be huge? Will they revive the brand if they're good? I just don't know. But I think that Hollywood, and this is not to blame Disney, they're just enamored with IPs across the board. It's all they care about, sequels and franchises and reboots and reimaginings. It's the coin of the realm right now because there's so much uncertainty from a financial point of view in Hollywood. So you kind of can't blame Disney for sticking with this and doing everything possible. But I think some introspection, I think some maybe quality control would certainly help. And stop insulting the fans and maybe just gently ask the actors to do the same. Listen, there's always free speech. Actors can say what they want. I don't want to restrict that. But, if you pull one of the stars aside, say, listen, can you not insult the fans? They're here for you. They want to come to see the product. And if you insult them, the box office will go down. Don't do that. So we'll see. We'll see. I am certainly skeptical, but the little kid in me would like to see another great Star Wars movie, and I don't think I'm alone.